Hey, how's it going? It's a snowy day in Seattle today, and I thought this would be a good time to show some techniques that I've learned with NestJS specifically on how to create CRUD APIs as fast as possible. What you're looking at on the screen here is what we're going to make today. Notice that it's completely documented. You see all of the CRUD routes. You got your create, read, update, and delete, as well as a few extra ones. And it also shows you the different schemas of the resources that we're working with. So for example, right now we have a CRUD for a user entity that has a first name and a last name, and we've got all the documentation here on how to interact with that resource and get information about it. So to show you guys that this is completely working, as an example, I can do a post here to create a new user. Maybe I'll give that a name of John Doe. Okay, and when I execute that, you'll notice that it responded with a resource that was created. It also has an ID generated over there. We can also give the bulk create a shot, so that one's kind of similar. You can just provide an array of those same objects. So maybe you can do Jane Doe, and maybe we got a family of those here. Let's add Jack and Jill. All right, execute. Notice that we just created 3 more resources, and when we go over to the get routes, notice that we have a bunch of options here that I'll talk about in a second. But if I just straight up execute that, we'll get back all of the users that we created so far. You can also do get by ID. So for example, we know that the first one we created was John Doe. If I provided an ID of 1 here, execute, we get John Doe. And then back into the get all here. So I said I was going to talk about these. There's a bunch of these options that you can add. So for example, maybe you just wanted the first name, and maybe let's do some pagination. So I want to do when I get the first page, and on each page I just want to show 2 people. Let's take a look at what that produces. So you'll notice we get back an array with 2 people, and then it shows the details about the remaining pages. And then also notice that now we're only pulling in the first name. So you can almost kind of make this work similar to like GraphQL, where you can request the very specific data attributes that you want. And then there's even things like filters and all that stuff. So for example, maybe I'm trying to filter the list down to just the ones that have the name John. So if I execute that, we'll notice that we get back John, and there's only 1 user in our database that has John in it. So you'll only get back 1 data, 1 page, total 1. And then of course we got our other routes. Like for example, we got updating. Maybe I want to update John to have a different name. Different Doe, I don't know. Right, execute. Now that we'll notice John got updated. Well, now he's not John, he's different. So if we do another get all, we should be able to notice that we still have our 4 users, but now you got different Doe on the first one, right? So this is a fully functional CRUD REST API with documentation and all of those features that you just saw. And I didn't even cover all of these. There's delete, there's patching, all of that we're gonna do in probably 5 to 10 minutes, or maybe less. I don't know, we'll see, but it's very quick. I'll show you in just a second. So make sure to stick around, and let's figure out how to do this. So I mentioned to you we're going to use NestJS. It's an awesome framework to use for Node.js backend development. All right, so I'm going to assume that we're starting from scratch. So let's take a look at the documentation here, and I'll kind of point you on where you should look. But basically, we're going to install a couple of things here. So you can see on the left here, it says that if you haven't used Nest before, you should install the Nest CLI. So that's just npm install -g at nestjs/cli. I already have this installed, so it should go pretty quick. And then once you have that installed, you just do nest new and then the name of your project. We're gonna call this one CRUD demo. And it's gonna ask you what do you want to use as your package manager. I'm just gonna go with Yarn. I think a lot of people, sorry, we're gonna go with npm. I think a lot of people already know how to use npm. And it's gonna take a moment to install here. There we go. Once it's done, I am just going to cd into the newly created project, and I'm gonna open up Visual Studio Code from there. Alright, so this is the generated project from Nest. You can take a look what that made. It just has a basic app module and a controller in there. If we run npm run start dev, it's going to start running the application on localhost 3000. So if you go to localhost 3000, you should see a hello world there. So now we're kind of back from our skeleton application here, and we're going to build up to the thing I showed you in the beginning of this video. First, we're going to do a little bit of cleanup. We don't really need these app controller and app service. You can delete that. All right, so now we just got basically an empty module. Next, we're going to use the Nest CLI to generate our users module. So this is one of the really nice things with Nest and their CLIs. It just kind of auto generates a lot of the files and stuff for you and wires it all up. It really saves you a lot of time. So we can do nestg. G is kind of short for generate. You can also do generate, but G is the shorthand. So I'm going to do nestg module users. And you'll notice as this generates that file, it also updates my app module with the users module as an import. Okay, and then we're also going to do nestg controller users, and then nestg service users. All right, and what did that do? You'll notice that it added a bunch of new files into our users folder, and then it also wired it up all perfectly. You know, we now have this module, this users module, updated with that controller and the service. And if we open up the users controller, there's nothing really here yet. So just as a quick to make sure that this is working, we can do get users. All right, we're just gonna do a sample thing here, and then we're gonna run our application npm run start dev. And if you go back to our browser, I refresh this. Since I deleted the app controller, this is now giving me a 404. But when I go to /users, which we now have a users controller on the right, we've got the users, right? So that's just making sure that it works. You can also delete this app controller test file, by the way. All right, from here, the next thing we're going to add is in main.ts, we're going to add our Swagger configuration. I'm not going to spend too much time kind of explaining this part, but it is very well documented in the Nest website. So if you go to the recipes on the left here and then head on over to OpenAPI Swagger, everything I'm going to do in the next 2 minutes or so is documented here. So first we're going to npm install all of this, the Swagger module and the UI Express. I'm going to put that in my terminal. And then I'm also going to copy some of this initial configuration here, and we'll just manipulate it a little bit. All right, so I'm going to put that in the middle here. And I've got some missing imports, so I'm going to do import document builder and import Swagger module. Right, and what that does is it just adds it up here. And then let's update this to title of users CRUD, and some description. Let's clean it up a little bit. We don't need this tag. And this string here is kind of the position where the documentation will be hosted in. I'm just going to make that a slash so that when we go to localhost 3000, it's going to show us our documentation. So let's take a look at what this generates. So when I go back and run npm start dev, when we go back to our browser on localhost, just the base host, now we've got our Swagger documentation, right? It's already working. Now we're still pretty far from what I showed you in the beginning of the video, but we'll get to that in a second. But this is just setting it up so that as our routes get built, we have completely documentation that is usable here. And you can also use the Swagger here to kind of use it as a tester. It's not only a documentation, it's also a place for testing your work. So kind of like, you might do this in Postman or Insomnia, so you can execute on the documentation directly. All right, next, what we're going to do is we're going to do our configuration for the database. What we're going to use today is a SQLite database. You absolutely can use whatever database that you would like, but for simplicity, we're going to stick with SQLite. So again, I'm going to show you the documentation so that you kind of know how to set this up in the future on your own. So under the techniques here on the left, there's a section there on database, which is very well written. Like honestly, just follow this and you'll be good to go. You'll notice that they're very big on recommending TypeORM as the ORM choice, but you can use whatever you want really. But the TypeORM has really good integration with Nest, so I highly recommend it as well. So I'm going to copy the installation here, but I'm not going to include the MySQL. I'm going to use SQLite. So in my terminal, I'm going to paste that in, and then I'm going to add SQLite 3. While that's installing, if you take a look at this documentation, it shows you that to create your database connection, you import this TypeORM module and put it into the imports of your app module. So we're going to do something similar, except that the connection object that we're going to pass in here is for SQLite instead of MySQL. All right, so now I'm in the app module, app.module.ts, and we're going to add our database connection. So I'm just going to paste some code in here. Again, the documentation kind of talks about this, but basically you do TypeORM module for root, and then within that function call, you're going to add your database connection details. So now that we have our database connection, the next thing we're going to do is create a new entity file. We're going to call it user.entity.ts, and what this is effectively, it's just a class that represents the user table that we're going to create in our database. So from when we started with the video, you might have noticed that there is an ID, which is a number, and then there's a first name, which is a string, and then a last name, which is also a string, right? And you can add whatever other details that you want here. We're going to keep it pretty simple. And then to kind of officially make this a TypeORM entity, we're going to add entity up here. So I had it auto import for me, and then each of these needs to have a column. I'm hitting tab here just so you know of how that import is being added. Okay, so this is kind of marking these fields as columns in our user table. The ID, I'm going to put something kind of special there. I'm going to use primary generated column. what this will do by default is kind of turn it into a incrementing integer in a database. So as you create a user, for example, the first one will be 1, the second one will be 2. If you kind of look back from our demo earlier, you probably have noticed that. And then one last thing we're going to add here, this one might not make sense right away, but I'll talk about it in a little bit. We're going to add API property here from NestJS Swagger. This is just so that when you look at the documentation, you can see the shape of our schema there as well. All right, so now we have our entity class. When you run the application at this point, it should make a new user table in the database automatically. Next, what we're going to talk about here is how do we generate that CRUD? All of those, create, read, update, delete routes. How do we do that in as little time as possible? If you're familiar with Nest, you might know that the CLI actually also has a CRUD generator, which works if you did nestg resource user. It's going to generate a bunch of stuff for you, like the user's controller and the user service and the module, but it's not going to be hooked up to the database. So there's still quite a bit for you to implement. So you'll notice in the documentation, it says that the generated service classes are not tied to any specific ORM. So that basically means that it's going to generate the bones for you, but it's not going to be fully implemented. You still have quite a bit of work. So we're not going to go that route. What we're actually going to use is this library called NestJS CRUD. And you can kind of see the features from this package, right? A lot of this stuff I kind of went over, the ability to kind of do it very quickly, easily. And then it has all of those different features like pagination, filtering, sorting, right? All of the things that you likely need in a RESTful API. When you click on the docs here, it's going to open up to this page, and then it's going to show you the other things that you need to install. So we're going to go ahead and do that. So I'm going to copy this. So back to my terminal here, I'm going to install that, the CRUD package, class transformer, and class validator. And then it also says that if you're using TypeORM, you got to install these things. So I'm also going to do npm install the CRUD TypeORM. These two packages, I think we actually already installed that earlier, so technically you don't need that. But now that we've got all of those installed, here's where the stuff starts becoming real. So going back to our users controller, now let's make this real, right? We don't really need this. We're going to delete that. What we're going to add here is a new decorator, simply called CRUD. And you can pass in an object there for the configuration. First, let's import this CRUD from that package that we just installed. And then what you want to provide in here, the minimal thing you need to provide is the model that it represents. So we're saying that this controller is for the resource of user, which is our entity. So this is still a base class. There's one more thing we need to add in here. We want to add that it implements CRUD controller. With a generic type of user. All right, and also add that into our imports. Now this just kind of says that it's implementing this interface, and you'll notice you get a red squiggly here because it's expecting a service property which needs to be injected via the constructor. So let's add a constructor here that has a public service property, and that is the type of user service. This might not make sense as you're following me, but it's gonna make sense in a little bit here. And we want to make sure that that's imported. And at first it's still gonna stay that the type of service is incorrect. So you see this red squiggly here because we also need to update our user service to kind of hook it into the package that we just installed. So within the user service, we're gonna add a couple other things here. We're gonna do extends TypeORM CRUD service that also has a type of user. So this is where it starts to kind of have the magic behind the scenes. And then also needs a constructor. We're just gonna do inject repository of type user. So the repo, and then we're just gonna pass that to the super. Right. Again, probably does not make a ton of sense, but just bear with me here. So what this effectively does is it kind of injects the repository from TypeORM into the constructor of this TypeORM CRUD service, and this comes from the thing we installed earlier. Now with all of that out of the way, let's go and start and see what we have. npm run start dev. So as I run this, it's telling me that user service is missing a dependency because I forgot one piece here, so we're going to correct that. Because we're trying to inject a repository of user in a service, I really should have added a new import here. Imports TypeORM module that for feature user. And I realize if you're fairly new to Nest, none of this probably made any sense to you. Just a quick side note, if you go into the documentation for the database, so under techniques database, it talks about a lot of this stuff where if you were doing your database connection, right, we did the connection object, and then once you do that, it tells you that for the modules that is looking to import a repository for that entity that you have, so for example user, it tells you that in the module of that you need to specify an import with the entities that you're looking to access in that module. So in our example, we got the users module, we want to access the users table. So you want to make sure that you have your TypeORM module for feature user, and then when the service, you're able to do your inject repository, and from that repository you can start using the different methods that Nest provides for accessing that database table. So back in our code, I ran npm start dev again, everything's working. Let's take a look at the browser and see what we've got. So if we refresh on localhost 3000, now we're back to where we started, right? So everything that I showed in the beginning, it's here, it's working. Let's give it a shot. Let's do a bulk insert of some users. Maybe let's do test A and test B. Execute. Notice that we got a 201, that means it worked. And when we go to our get users, you can try it out. Execute. We got an array. We can do get by ID. So we know that the first one has ID of 1. If I do user/1, execute, we got our test A. Right, it's working. Let's try our update. So let's do a patch here on user 1. I'm going to change the first name to John, last name Doe. Execute. It's working. And just to show you, if I do a get users again, execute, now we got John Doe test B, and let's try delete. I'm going to delete John Doe, ID 1, execute, and then if we go back to, again, our get all, execute, now we just got one object because we just deleted, right? So we're back where we started, didn't spend a lot of time, right? And we generated a fully working CRUD API that is fully documented. It has all these features of being able to specify what field do you want. You can filter by certain values, like maybe you're looking for a person with a specific name. You can do sorting, like for example, you want to do alphabetical order of by name. You can do joins. So this is like if you have relationships in your database entities. So for example, maybe a user has one too many pictures. You can do a join here so that you can get the user's object along with their pictures. And then we kind of showed earlier that you can do pagination. So there you have it, a fully working CRUD in just a few minutes. I'm probably going to edit the video to cut off some of the points where I'm installing and kind of just pausing, reading documentation. So you can kind of see that if you know how to do this well, it can really speed up your process if you're making CRUD APIs very often. There are some things that you can also add to this if you want to further customize it. So the nice thing with the CRUD package that we used is it doesn't box you in. If you take a look at the documentation, you'll notice that it does allow you to further customize it to your needs. So for example, maybe you want to do authentication, maybe you want to do some validation. It has all of that handled. So for example, maybe in your entity, only some things are required or optional depending on if you're updating or creating. There's documentation on here for maybe you want to completely customize each route. So you'll see that it allows you to do overrides like this, and then you can add in your own logic. All right, so that's it for today. Hope you enjoyed that video. I'm really interested in making more content like this. This is full stack stuff, front end, back end. You'll see more of that stuff in my channel. Testing, algorithms, data structures. Those are a lot of things that I'm interested in teaching. So if you like this kind of content, make sure to subscribe, and also make sure to hit that thumbs up. It really helps the YouTube algorithm to find my video and kind of share it to people like you who might have a lot of interest in this kind of content. Anyways, that's it. Have a good day, and I'll see you on the next video.